everything I'm writing, Peter, has one goal, and that is to help bring down this Israeli government.
New York Times foreign affairs columnist Thomas Friedman is pretty clear about his desire to see Benjamin Netanyahu's government out of power.
Because this Israeli government is warped and disturbed and is not a partner for anything. Bibi Netanyahu, because he needs to stay out of jail, he brought into power in Israel the American equivalent of the Proud Boys. And so my goal, Peter, openly, I'm doing everything I can to contribute to the downfall of this government, because until it's gone, Israel won't be right, and nothing will be right.
And when he says this Israeli government is not a partner for anything, he has one big thing on his mind: a two-state solution, one for the Israelis and one for the Palestinians. If you're familiar with Tom Friedman's work over the last 45 years, you'll know a few things. He's not afraid to say what he thinks when it comes to Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Middle East more generally. He's also a staunch supporter of Israel's right to exist, but is an unabashed critic of Benjamin Netanyahu and some of the people he's put into key positions, most notably the far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich.
These are Jewish supremacists who believe Jews were promised every square inch from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And it's their biblical patrimony. And part of preparing the ground for the Messiah to return is that Jews should be controlling that territory entirely.
So those beliefs make them an impediment to peace and the one way out of this war and the endless cycle of conflict, occupation, and terror. The establishment of two states. And make no mistake, Friedman doesn't believe Hamas is a partner for lasting peace either.
The only way to delegitimize Hamas is if Palestinians do it. You know, one of my fundamental rules of the Middle East is that extremists go all the way and moderates tend to just go away.
Friedman understands the Middle East. He's been covering it since 1979, when he first went to Lebanon as a reporter.
You know, there are vintage years in wine, Peter, and there are vintage years in history. And 1979 was the Chateau Margaux of modern historical years. And I just happened to be there, little Tommy Friedman, in Beirut, working on a typewriter.
He became the Beirut bureau chief for the New York Times, and then the Jerusalem bureau chief.
Whatever Netanyahu says to you in English in private is irrelevant. All that matters is what he says in Hebrew in public. That's my first rule. My second rule as a journalist is if Netanyahu is offering you an interview as a journalist, that's not a compliment. There's a 90% chance that's only happening because he thinks he can snooker you.
And eventually he became the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times. He's written about the two-state solution and what it would mean for Israelis, Palestinians, and many other countries. And he's also proposed ways to get there.
I am a firm believer in the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, but also a firm believer that Palestinians have the same right, because I know what is 100% the alternative, and that's a forever war.
Coming up, why Friedman believes a two-state solution is still possible and how it can be achieved. I'm Peter Bergen, and this is In the Room. Where were you on October 7th, and what did you think?
We have a home in California, in Monterey, and I was there. I was obviously shocked, stunned, but I chose actually, Peter, not to, as I might have, get on a plane and rush off to Israel. I'm now 70. I've been reporting on this conflict almost 45 years, and I have seen Israelis and Palestinians and Arabs, and Americans and Arabs. I have seen them do such terrible, violent things to each other in those 45 years. I've just seen terrible, terrible things. And one thing I've learned from all that is that the most dangerous words you can utter as a reporter in the Middle East is, the world will never be the same. I've seen just really, really bad stuff. And the world is often just the same. And so my initial reaction was to keep my distance and to try to think clearly about it, less emotionally if I could. And so if you read my stuff, my original reaction was, Israel, please ask yourself, what does your worst enemy want you to do right now? Your worst enemy, Iran and Hamas, want you to do just what America did after 9/11. Run off into a war with no plan for the morning after and get stuck in a moral, military, and economic overstretch.
Is that what happened?
I think we're in the middle of determining that. But that was my worry. So my initial argument was make this Operation Rescue Grandma, is what I called it, that focus entirely on the hostages, the hostage taking, the abduction of infants and grandparents, the rape of Israeli women. Focus on that, and you have a chance to truly delegitimize Hamas. Unfortunately, that advice wasn't taken.
And it wouldn't be out of the question to take his advice. After all, American presidents read his columns. Barack Obama sounded him out about the Middle East. Yet, what's happened since Israel went into Gaza 8 months ago, following the brutal attacks on October 7th, is this. Some 1,200 Israelis were killed. More than 37,000 people have been killed in Gaza, according to local health authorities. 12,000 children have been injured in Gaza, and some 116 hostages remain in captivity, about 40 of whom are thought to be dead. Friedman believes there needs to be an end to this war and to the cycle of wars that preceded it through a two-state solution. But that two-state solution has been attempted several times in the past, long before Hamas was even in power in Gaza, most notably in the 1990s with the Oslo Accords, a set of agreements negotiated between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, which among other things established the Palestinian Authority, or PA, to govern over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The PLO also recognized Israel's right to exist in peace. The goal was to reach a two-state solution. But that didn't happen. There was another attempt in 2000 with the Camp David summit brokered by President Bill Clinton, which brought Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat together. And there was also the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, a plan endorsed by the 22 member states of the Arab League, including Saudi Arabia. But these attempts ultimately failed to negotiate a final agreement.
So you could then say, well, Tom, why are you for a two-state solution now? And I have two answers. One is, everyone's been writing, been so many articles of late, some of which I take personally, which is that two-state solution is impossible. It's a delusion. It's a fantasy. To which I say, oh, thank you. I had no idea. I thought it was a slam dunk. Thank you for telling me it's really, really unlikely. I would actually say it's got about a 5% chance. And I'm going to devote 110% of my energy to making that 5% a reality, because I know what is 100% the alternative, and that's a forever war.
I mean, it's worth noting Cromwell went into Ireland several hundred years before the Good Friday Agreement. So, things can change.
Exactly. They can change and they can change back. Leadership matters. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be a fight.
You mentioned leadership.
Yeah, I'm afraid leadership is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's more than one person. Both Israelis and Palestinians kind of went into Oslo with their fingers crossed. Arafat basically made peace with one hand and supported terrorism with the other. And Israel made peace with one hand and supported settlements with the other. It's worth, to me, one more college try, one more good college try, Peter.
Yeah.
And when that doesn't work, you know what it's worth then? One more good college try, because the alternative is awful.
Friedman has been advocating for that fight for a two-state solution for as long as he's been sharing his opinions. Like, for example, in 2002. It wasn't quite a year since the 9/11 attacks, which had been perpetrated by, among others, 15 hijackers who were Saudis. And Friedman says he held the Saudis responsible for their part in the 9/11 attacks. So Friedman thought there was an opportunity here for Saudi Arabia to play a new, more constructive role by brokering a peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. So he wrote a column about it using a clever conceit.
At the time, I occasionally wrote columns about Bill Clinton that were phony letters from Clinton to world leaders. I would make them up entirely, but based on a lot of reporting, so they would sound really authentic. Anyways, Bush is now president. So I thought of writing a letter from George Bush to the leaders of all the Arab League countries saying, guys, in the wake of 9/11, you really need to try to do something constructive. Why don't you declare a peace plan calling for full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and East Jerusalem, also Gaza at the time, and in return for full peace, normalization, trade, diplomatic relations, the whole 9 yards. I had that idea.
So he wrote the column, and he proposed that in return for a total Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories and the establishment of a Palestinian state, the 22 members of the Arab League would offer full diplomatic relations with Israel, normalized trade, and security guarantees. That column was published in the New York Times. And then he received an invitation.
The Saudi embassy spokesman, a man named Adel al-Jubeir, comes to me and says, have you ever been to Saudi Arabia? I said, well, as a matter of fact, Adel, I have. And he says, well, would you like to come again? And I said, well, I'm beating your brains in as hard as I can, but sure, I'll come, And then he went off on this trip to Saudi Arabia.
After about a week in Saudi Arabia, he received an invitation to come to dinner from the Crown Prince Abdullah, who was the de facto ruler of the Saudi kingdom at the time.
And we went to the dinner, and it was one of these big Saudi dinners, all men, a giant buffet stretching miles. At about midnight, he says, come back to my house. So we walked back to his house and sat at a small desk, and he began by saying, you broke into my drawer. I said, Your Highness, what are you talking about? Well, that peace plan you put out, that was my idea. I said, oh, really? Tell me about it. And for the next 3 hours, basically, he played back my own peace plan and basically said, this is my idea. This is what I want to do it. We want the Jewish people to know they are not an eternal enemy. It's about the occupation. And we went around and around on it until about 3 a.m. And about 3 a.m., I stood up to go and I said, Your Highness, this is so important. You need to put this out to the world. And he said, well, you just say it, as if I'm thinking it. I said, no, you say it. He said, no, you say it. I said, no, you say it. He said, no, you say it. So we went back and forth, and Adel translating in between this ping pong match. And finally, I said, here's the deal. I'm going to write it up as you've said it on the record, and you'll look at it and you'll tell me if you want to go with it. And I went back to my hotel room, didn't sleep, wrote it up as an interview, and faxed it to them. There was no email at the time. And a couple hours later, Adel called back and said, go with it, it's yours.
Several days passed before the column actually went into print. But in the meantime, as he met with other Saudi officials, Friedman realized that no one else in the Saudi government was aware of the Crown Prince's decision to put this idea for a peace plan out into the world.
I did tell him one thing. I said, Adel, I'm actually staying here till Monday. My column comes out Sunday, and there's only one thing I care about, how you translate this on the Saudi press agency in Arabic. And if you screw me, I have a Wednesday column, and I will screw you back. Okay? Okay, so I was not going to have my column out there in English and then have them say, hey, it was a mistranslation. We really meant, this or that. Did I understand, Peter, this was an attempt to deflect attention from 9/11? Absolutely. I knew just what was going on. But my attitude was, boy, if this is how they want to do it in a constructive way, I'm all for it.
The column came out, and Friedman did an interview about it with an Israeli journalist.
Because I wanted Israelis to understand this was real and important. And then they immediately called an Arab summit for March 27, 28 in Beirut to turn this interview into an Arab peace initiative. And tragically, on the evening of March 27,
suicide bomber. Another deadly attack in Israel on one of the holiest days of the year.
A terrorist group blew up a Passover Seder in the Israeli resort town of Netanya, killing and wounding close to 100 people.
The bomber entered the hotel through the front door, walked through the lobby, and blew himself up in the dining room.
Sacred night for Jews around the world. A suicide bomber came to destroy himself among Jews celebrating Passover.
And that terrorist group, Peter, it had a name, and its name was Hamas.
Hamas is a militant Islamist movement that was founded in Gaza in 1987 during the First Intifada, or uprising, against the Israeli occupation. It grew out of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist group that has its roots in Egypt. In 2006, Hamas won a majority in local elections in Gaza, and it's often used suicide bombings to attack Israeli civilians and soldiers, like the attack in Netanya.
The attack in Israel has obviously cast a pall over the opening session of the Arab League summit here in Beirut. There was reaction almost immediately afterwards, one from a Hamas official based here in Beirut. This official saying that those attacks, those kinds of attacks, would continue as long as the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands continue.
So that's why I detest these people. That on the day that the Arab world came together in the form of the Arab League, to pass the first full-scale, two-state Arab peace initiative, what was Hamas's response? It was to blow up a Passover Seder in Netanya.
Tom, I remember that column coming out, and the reaction was seismic. Because here we have, he's the crown prince of the family, is the keeper of the holy places. That's part of their title. For them to kind of essentially give their, not just political benediction, but religious benediction in a sense to this. It was a huge, huge deal.
Let me stick on that story because, again, to understand everything I've been writing, Peter, you have to go back to my experience, for me, of being in Beirut in 1979. Now, of all those events that I was witness to and just trying to navigate, the most important was actually the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Fundamentalist, puritanical jihadis took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca. The Saudis eventually got them out of the mosque. They executed these fundamentalists. But then they did something that had one of the most profound impacts in the 20th and 21st centuries. Before 1979, you had women airline attendants on Saudi Airlines. You had women on TV in Saudi Arabia. It was in a process of opening. And basically, the bargain that the Saudi ruling family engaged in after was to say to their religious fundamentalist clergy and hierarchy, you are going to have a free rein in determining social and religious policy, and just leave us alone, we'll control the rest. Saudi Arabia was then competing suddenly with Iran for who was the most legitimate, and Saudi Arabia basically took the entire Arab Muslim world on a right turn. So in 2016, I think it was, I got a call from an Arab journalist friend of mine who said there's a new Saudi crown prince, deputy crown prince. His name is Mohammed bin Salman, and he'd like to meet you. Would you come over and meet him? I said, sure. I go over and meet him, and we did an interview. It was only in Arabic at the time. And I was really impressed. It was a different kettle of fish, this kid. He had a real, totally domestic reform agenda. It wasn't just letting women drive or go to soccer games. He took the religious police off the streets. He told the mosques to turn down their volume. He told young people, you got to get a degree in something more than Islamic studies. And that's why, even though he did one of the most ugly, vile, evil, and stupid things any leader could do, which was kill actually a reformer who wanted to be part of the process, Jamal Khashoggi, I have continued to support the initiative because I think it is as world reshaping as 1979 was world shaping.
And of course, part of that is MBS's embrace of the two-state solution. It's hard for listeners to recall, but if you go back to October 6th, you have Israeli government officials actually celebrating Jewish prayer rituals in Saudi Arabia. Yep. You have an Israeli cabinet minister visiting Saudi Arabia.
Let's go back to October 6th. What was going on in the world on October 6th? Basically, my shorthand is that Ukraine was trying to join the West and Israel was trying to join the East. If Ukraine is able to join the European Union over time, can't happen overnight, we will have the biggest expansion of a Europe whole and free since East Germany joined West Germany. Putin understood that if Ukraine is allowed to join the West, it is a fundamental game changer. So he moved to stop it. The same thing with Israel. If Israel were able to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia on terms, I would argue, hopefully that would also make a significant advance toward a two-state solution with Palestinians. It would have been the biggest expansion of an inclusive Middle East since Camp David. And what happened on October 7th was a fundamental battle over that. Because if Ukraine can join the West and Israel can join the East, we're going to have a post-Cold War world of much greater inclusion. And if we don't, we're going to have one of much greater resistance.
You wrote a piece, Israel has a choice to make, Rafah or
Yes.
Riyadh. So walk us through kind of the main points of that.
Well, I think that the Saudis, I was just in Riyadh a few weeks ago, remain committed to normalizing with Israel as part of this new security agreement it wants to forge with the United States. Because MBS does have a vision, and his vision is of a Middle East that looks a lot like the European Union, with Saudi Arabia playing Germany. And that's what he's focused on.
The fact that they're the keeper of the holy places does sort of, and as I understand it, King Salman, the father, has always been, very much in favor of a real Palestinian state. So what are the Saudis looking for? They must be looking for some real guarantees, not just some sort of idle chatter.
MBS told me that he took a poll before October 6th and asked Saudis how they felt about normalization with Israel. And roughly 70% said they were good with it as long as it was paired with a process for Palestinian statehood one day. Might not have been quite that specific, but they wanted to make sure Palestinians weren't abandoned. But otherwise, that a majority was good with it. Now, today, I don't think you'd take the poll.
In May, Israel, at least for the moment, chose Rafah and not Riyadh. Despite pleas from the United States and other countries, Israeli forces entered into the heavily populated area of Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians were then living.
At least 45 people were killed after an Israeli airstrike targeted this camp for displaced Palestinians in western Rafah, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Their blood-curdling screams tell the story of the unfolding horror more than words ever could. But it is only as bodies are pulled out of the inferno that the scale of this attack becomes clear.
And just as Israeli battalions were moving deeper into central Rafah, President Joe Biden laid out what he said was an Israeli proposal to get to a permanent ceasefire.
Now, after intensive diplomacy carried out by my team, my many conversations with leaders of Israel, Qatar, and Egypt, and other Middle Eastern countries, Israel has offered a comprehensive new proposal. It's a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the release of all hostages. That's the offer that's now on the table.
The plan would take place in 3 phases, and President Biden urged the Israelis to accept it.
The people of Israel should know they can make this offer without any further risk to their own security because they've devastated Hamas forces over the past 8 months. At this point, Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7th.
I mean, is there an alternative other than this sort of 3-phase plan that Biden has laid out? You talked about the lack of a plan for a day after. Obviously, you've got the defense minister saying that they have some kind of notional plan for a post-Hamas leadership in Gaza. You've also had Netanyahu saying the Palestinian Authority can't be part of it. You've criticized Netanyahu for that.
I have a very radical view on this, and that is what I would do if I were Israel right now, which is that I would tell Hamas, basically, we are ready for a permanent ceasefire. We're ready to get entirely out of Gaza, and we just want all our hostages back. Whatever prisoners you want, here they are, okay? Why do I say that? Because the first reaction is, but then Hamas Sinwar would just retake Gaza. To which I say, yes, that is the most likely outcome. But let's just think about that outcome for a second. Sinwar would have to come out of his tunnel, and 2 things would happen, I suspect. One is the morning after, he would be carried around on people's shoulders saying, you took on the Yehudis for 8 months, you took on their army, Thawrahat al-Nasr, you are our hero. The morning after, and every morning after that, I think you'd have a huge problem. Problem number 1. Let's see, Yahya. What is your great achievement? What is your great achievement? You got a permanent ceasefire from the Israelis, and you got them entirely out of Gaza. Oh, wait a minute, Yahya. What existed on October 6th? You had a permanent ceasefire and all the Israelis out of Gaza. You mean we fought this war? You took us into a war for 8 months. You basically destroyed most of the housing stock in Gaza. Thousands of our brothers and sisters were killed. To get back to where we were on October 6th, that's your heroic action? Oh, I want to be around for that conversation. Okay? I want him to own the rebuilding of Gaza. I want him to have to look his people in the eye. I want him to have to go to the world and say, we need help. We need help. Oh, but we're still going to fire rockets at Israel and dig more tunnels. No, I don't think that's going to happen. And now that Israel controls the Philadelphia corridor, the Egyptian entrance and exit into Gaza, and they now know how he got all these arms, he's not going to be able to rebuild. The only way to delegitimize Hamas is if Palestinians do it.
You have been a very prominent advocate of the two-state solution in the past several months since October 7th. And you've also correctly said, that you understand that it's not going to be easy. But how would it take place step by step, do you think?
Well, the first step has to be a new Israeli government that's ready to engage with the idea legitimately and positively, not reluctantly and subversively. We have to have a new Israeli government, just as you need a new Palestinian government on the other side. And I'm talking about both eliminating Hamas unless it embraces Oslo and getting the PA to be transformed. I think that's really the necessary ingredient. I think the first step would have to be giving greater Palestinian authority, over areas they now control, lifting checkpoints wherever you can, and getting a commitment to Israel to simply stop building any new settlements anywhere beyond the settlement blocks, and making that commitment as a commitment of seriousness. That would have to be step one. Where you'd go after that, 2, 3, 4, I'm not sure, but that would have to be step one.
So Friedman says in the first step, you'd have to get rid of the current Israeli government. So what would it take to bring down the Netanyahu government?
I think the way you get this government down is to multi-step process. You tell Netanyahu that if he will abandon Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and their 14 seats and agree to some kind of horizon for Palestinians, he can be remembered not as the prime minister on October 7th, but the father of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if he does that, the president will then give him a plea bargain in which, if he agrees to retire from politics, the cases against him will be dropped. I think that's the way to do it. It's got to be a combination of the personal and the political, because he's motivated by both, so you've got to address both. And presto changeo, you could have a very different Israel as a result.
Have you ever seen the 2012 film, The Gatekeepers?
Yes, I have, yeah.
I thought it was revelation because, as you know, it's 6 former leaders of Shin Bet, the domestic intelligence service, all of whom said versions of the same thing, which is we win every battle, but we're losing the war. Now, this is back in 2012. The film really struck home for me because these are the people who are in charge of these domestic intelligence services, and they all seem to have the same view.
So in my book that I'm writing, I have a chapter on sort of just lessons I've learned over the years. And one of the lessons I've learned, I have in that chapter, is it's in the form of a question. Why has every Israeli intelligence chief, military and Mossad and Shin Bet, whom I've gotten to know, why are virtually all of them doves? That's really interesting. Like, of all people, why are they all doves? And the reason is twofold. One is they know the real balance of power. They know how strong Israel is. And number two, more importantly, they see every day how corrosive and corrupting is the occupation, morally, financially, politically, militarily. And they know just how bad it is for Israel.
You've written that Hamas is not a partner for a secure peace with Israel. So who might be?
I think you have to go back to the Palestinian Authority and to the PLO, and you have to challenge them to come up with a negotiating team that is legitimate in Palestinian eyes, legitimate because it has the blessings of the PLO, and legitimate because it's led by the best and the brightest of Palestinians. And as part of that blessing, as part of that coalition, there's going to have to be a Muslim Brotherhood element. They can't be called Hamas as a party unless they want to embrace Oslo and become part of the solution. I think it's very naive to think that you can have a legitimate, effective Palestinian Authority that doesn't have political representation of Hamas in the context of those people embracing the Oslo Peace Treaty.
Are you suggesting that, if you got rid of anybody who'd had any association with Hamas, you wouldn't have a functional civil society in Gaza?
Yeah, this was a social movement, as well as a terrorist organization, as well as recently an army, and it's embedded in Gazan society. It's also a tyrannical organization, feared and disliked also. So I'm not making a case for Hamas, but there is an Islamist trend in Palestinian politics, just as there is in Israeli Arab politics. I think it would be very unwise to tell Palestinians, this is who can represent you and this is who can't. That's how you get a lot of Palestinians who will be taken out by Hamas.
Two of your colleagues, Ronan Bergman and Mark Mazzetti, wrote a very deep account of the settler movement, and I'm just going to quote one sentence from it. After 50 years of crime without punishment, in many ways the violent settlers and the state have become one.
That's just absolutely what's gone on here, And I've watched it all happen and found it appalling and opposed it and believe it is a fundamental threat to the prospect that Israel will have a 150th anniversary.
While the settler movement represents only one small piece of Israeli society, a recent poll shows that 65% of Israelis oppose a two-state solution. Friedman says he doesn't pay much attention to those polls while the hostages are still held in captivity by Hamas because it's disturbed the Israeli psyche. But he does acknowledge that the larger peace movement that once existed in Israel, known as the Peace Now movement, which once was a political force to reckon with, doesn't really exist anymore. Friedman thinks that instead there are many Israelis that are looking just for a way to completely sever ties with the Palestinians.
I don't think there is a peace movement in the sense you had with Peace Now back in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, but I think there's an even bigger separation movement. Can we separate? I'm talking about divorce, not marriage. And I think after the dust settles here, the movement for safe separation, I think there'll be a real case for that. I've been doing this, Peter, since 1979, and I'm pretty much an open book, fortunately, today with both readers and parties on both sides. What you see with me is what you get. I'm always proud of my religious background, and I'm for a two-state solution because I believe the Jewish people have a right to self-determination and a right to self-defense in their historic homeland, and because I believe that Palestinians have a right to self-determination and self-defense in their historic homeland. And the only way for both to be at home is if the other is. That's what I believed when I was an undergrad at Brandeis, and that's what I believe as I'm in the sunset years at the New York Times. Never changed, never wavered. That's how I see it. And if you believe that, you're my friend. If you don't believe that, you're not my friend. And over the years, there have been a lot of people tried to do psychological diagnosis of me, and I'm this and I'm that, and I'm secretly this and I'm secretly that. No, it's all here. If it's not clear to you after 45 years, then it's not going to be clear. So that's who I am.
If you want to learn some more about the issues we discussed in today's episode, we recommend From Beirut to Jerusalem by Thomas Friedman. A new edition of that book comes out in October. The book is available on Audible. In the Room with Peter Bergen is an Audible original, produced by Audible Studios and Fresh Produce Media. This episode was produced by Alexandra Salomon with help from Nathan Ray. Our executive producer is Alison Craiglow. Katie McMurrin is our technical director. Our staff also includes Eric German, Laura Tillman, Luke Cregan, Holly DeMuth, Sandy Malera, and JP Swenson. Our theme music is by Joel Picard. Our executive producers for Fresh Produce Media are Colin Moore and Jason Ross. Our head of development is Julian Ambler. Our head of production is Eleanor Bavietz. Maureen Traynor is our head of operations. Our production manager is Herminio Ochoa. Our production coordinator is Henry Koch. and our delivery coordinator is Ana Paula Martinez. Audible's Chief Content Officer is Rachel Giazza, Head of Content Acquisition and Development and Partnerships Pat Shah, Audible Executive Producer Lara Regan Kleinschmidt. Special thanks to Marlon Calby, Alison Weber, and Vanessa Harris. Copyright 2024 by Audible Originals LLC. Sound recording copyright 2024 by Audible Originals LLC.